Thanks everyone for joining today. This masterclass with Dacher is part of a workshop that we're running focused on community-driven governance online. This is being run as part of the social media governance initiative within the Justice Collaboratory housed at the Yale Law School. My name is Matt Katsaros, and I'm the director of the SMGI, and it is my pleasure to be able to introduce our main speaker today, Dacher Keltner. Dacher is a professor of psychology at UC Berkeley and a founding director of the Greater Good Science Center. He's a writer of a couple best-selling books, one of which, The Power Paradox, we'll get to hear more about today. In that book, he has some of my all-time favorite studies that I've ever read, not just because they involve sending RAs into oncoming traffic or observing some people steal candy from children, but because they're studies that are novel, they're simple, and they're deeply insightful and reveal how power shapes our everyday interactions. In this session, Dacher will be presenting some work from that book and other work that tries to better understand the role that awe and beauty play in our lives. Following this, we have two discussants I'm excited to bring on the stage as well. They're going to respond to Dacher's work and try and place it into context of our focus today, which is community-driven governance online. Thinking through how we can take some of these ideas and insights and use them as kind of instruments in building healthier online communities in the future. The first discussant is Sarah Buig, who I've had the pleasure of being able to call a teammate not once, but twice. Sarah is a senior researcher at Twitter, where she studies the complicated socio-technical structures behind various types of misinformation and how it proliferates across the world online. The second discussant is Deepak Kumar. Deepak recently graduated from the University of Illinois with a PhD in computer science and is a postdoc at Stanford. Currently, he's working on tools to measure and mitigate the effects of online hate and harassment. And with that, I will stop talking and pass it over to Dacher. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Matt. And what a terrific opportunity to talk to all of you about one of the fundamental questions of our times, which is online community. And I'm going to tell you about the adventures of a social scientist. So I was down at Stanford giving a talk in 2009, talking about my work on compassion. And a Facebook engineer came by, Arturo Bejar, and said, "Hey, you want to try to build some compassion at Facebook?" And, you know, I am not technologically oriented. I was one of the last people to have a smartphone. Never been on Facebook, et cetera. But it was a really intriguing opportunity and a challenge in some sense. And over the next 12 years into the present day, I've had really a great privilege to work on a lot of interesting things at Facebook from 2010 to 2015. You know, how do we resolve conflicts online, catfights and self-harm and bad actors and bullying? A lot of work at the Google Empathy Lab with Daniel Credit Cobb on how do we teach the science of empathy to assistants? How do we build in the quest for awe and wonder into Google searches? A lot of work just mapping feelings, which I'll talk briefly about at Pinterest and their feelings project. And then a lot of visits to various secretive teams at Apple about, you know, how do we humanize and make more aesthetic our experiences with avatars and well-being and the like. And it has been one of the most challenging intellectual exercises as a social scientist to engage in this work. To me, from my particular theoretical perspective, there's just a fundamental challenge, which is I think we are increasingly learning that we are this hyper-social primate. Our sociality is deep, multifaceted, and fundamental. We're wired from the first moments of life to empathize, to synchronize. I was talking with Sarah, one of the discussants, to touch, to effervesce, to form community. Emotions are primary to what we do in the world. And yet, time and time again in my 12 years of work in this field, I've bumped into the impoverishment of technology. It's two-dimensional. It's modality impoverished, right? Touch is fundamental to community. You can't touch online. This is subtle, but I think really important. It is often lacking in social context. We speak to each other, recognizing the social context around us, and that's hard to represent online. And the timing of technology and communication is very strange, very different from our social lives. So as Matt said, I want to talk about three things today. Point one, throughout this work, one of the core principles that I've adhered to is design for empathic awareness. Just to be aware of other people's feelings. Maybe technology, with all of its reach, can be a way in which we learn more richly about other people's mental states and feelings. We know, in particular from work from Yale, Mark Brackett, teach people to just attend to other people carefully, and kids do better, grades go up, people lead more effectively, MDs treat patients better. Knowing the feelings of others is on balance a pretty good thing. And as one of the papers, I assigned a recent theoretical treatment of actually somebody who graduated from Yale as an undergrad and got his PhD at my lab, now doing fascinating machine learning work at Hume AI, Alan Cowan. And we have spent the past 5 years with new computational data-driven methods to map how we express, experience, emotion. And what we see is it's this wonderfully beautiful high dimensional space of 25 emotional expressions, 25 distinct experiences. Based on this science, I initiated a collaboration. I got called in, and a lot of different tech companies have been asking me to make avatars more emotionally rich, or assistants have better tones of voice, or emojis have more emotional richness. And so what I did with Facebook in about 2011 is have a Pixar artist draw different emotional states that you might represent as emoji. And here's some of the drawings. And I just love the subtlety of the artist's renditions. Look at that admiration expression up in the upper left, like, there goes my, my person I admire. Oddly enough, these are some of the expressions that I like most. You can code them anatomically. The numbers to the right refer to these action unit codes. And you can see the admiration and awe and coyness. I love that gratitude expression in all its modesty and reverence. And of course, the disagree expression for you parents out there, you'll see that in your 2-year-olds. This led to me a very subtle way to make online work more emotionally rich, this wonderful set of emoji. We named them Finch in honor of Charles Darwin. I think it's 16 different states that range from sympathy to awe to anger to love to gratitude. Tens of billions of these have been shared worldwide. We went into some interesting scientific adventures. We could get a sense of the emotional profile of cultures, which is interesting. And so this is a mapping of how much people send these emoji in different parts of the world. This is sympathy, just basic kindness for fellow human beings. I will note, you cross the border into Canada from the United States and the world becomes more sympathetic. And then you can look at angry cultures. This was, ironically, I stopped doing work as Trump was starting to campaign. And this was kind of a telling moment. Look at how angry the United States is compared to other cultures. So, interesting scientifically, this work led to a shift at Facebook that I was partially involved in, which I thought was going to be a good thing, which was the shift from just the like button to a richer, more empathetic portrayal of emotions. And we helped build, the science that I convey to them helped them select what new emotions to represent online. Some interesting descriptive facts. People share a lot of love displays. They love the ha-ha, laughter expression, etc. But here's a misuse and an insight. As we've recently learned, and I was, of course, not part of this, we learned that in this heated moment, Facebook prioritized content that arouses anger. Ironically, what's interesting about this is that the most commonly shared emoji after the like is the love icon or emoji, but they put their money for various obvious reasons on anger. So first insight is, if you really want to design for true empathy online and you're making things, users need to be aware of how their feelings are being used and the decision making of technologies, basic transparency. So, second observation, and this comes out of a lot of the work that I've done, both in the lab, and thank you, Matt, for your portrayal of our work, is I think this fundamental tension online between power and status, which I'll differentiate for you in just a second and spend some time doing so in the power paradox. And I think that as I've watched online behavior over the last 12 years, it has in many ways empowered many people. Power is in some sense more democratized, for better and for worse. Black Lives Matter, when I speak to their leaders, would be a different thing and may not exist without the power of online communication. And then the same you can say, of course, for white supremacy. It has empowered the many, but in my view, for interesting and difficult design reasons, I think it's degraded the substance of status and what we respect in other people and esteem. So I've spent 25 years in my career, as Matt said, trying to figure out power. I was raised by counterculture types. I didn't believe in power. I thought the world should be free of it. And now I believe the opposite, in line with Bertrand Russell, the great philosopher, the great mathematician and philosopher. Writing when Nazism was rising in Europe, he said, the fundamental concept in social science is power. The laws of social dynamics are laws that can only be stated in terms of power. That is true. Every dynamic is shaped by the manifold influences of power. So what is power? Power is this ability you have to stimulate, to stir, to advance the networks, greater good. This is a brilliant, one of the deepest statements about power is Hannah Arendt's writings about authoritarianism, must reads. Your power is not something of you, it is what people give to you. It's your ability to be empowered by a network of people. Michel Foucault, in his game-changing writings about power, anticipated this. He said, your power is employed and exercised through a net-like organization. Power is in your ability to stir others, right? It's always being negotiated. Very importantly, a lot of work has documented how the abuses of power, which I'll detail you for you in just a second, are just human nature. We find them in almost every human being. You will become self-serving and more impulsive with power, but very often in our social lives, we're constrained by things like Tom Tyler has studied at Yale, the fact that you're aware of other people scrutinizing your behavior, the fact that you are held accountable and need to be transparent in your decision-making. A lot of people have written about how the sense that other people control my status and empower me and really urge me to act on behalf of the greater good constrains the abuses of power. I'll just draw our attention to status. There's a lot of interesting work on here. The esteem you enjoy in other people's eyes. Cameron Anderson at Berkeley has made the argument that this is a basic need that we have. It's different from power, which is influencing networks. It's wanting to be appreciated. Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA, if I hear status enhancing words, safety networks in my brain light up. If we tend to give status to people who advance the greater good, and it really, our worry about our status makes us more collaborative. It makes us more polite in our speech. It makes us more cooperative. And if those two systems are really working together about your power and then your influence constraining it, you end up with healthy power. This is Christopher Bum writing about the qualities of leaders in the hunter-gatherer societies that he observed. Of course, lots of abuses of power. It's always a complex dynamic. But you can see in these attributes of leaders that it's a pretty desirable state of affairs. They're generous, brave, resolving conflicts, fair, impartial, upright, morally strong, and humble. The problem with power begins when those systems of constraint are eliminated. And as Matt said, what we find is when you give people unchecked power and they're not worried about their status, or they're acting anonymously, or they're not aware of the scrutiny that might be directed toward their behavior. Somebody writing about our research for the Atlantic magazine said turns you into it's almost as if you have brain damage. I didn't use those words. And somebody who had a brain trauma wrote me and said, actually, it's a lot worse. But what happens is it leads to behavior that's bad for communities. Things like, in uncivil language, shoplifting, sexual impropriety, rudeness, flames, sexual harassment. One of our first studies of this in 1996, a much different era in that little figure, we brought 3 people to the lab. One person was given power. In the middle of a boring experiment, we put out some chocolate chip cookies. Everybody got 1 cookie, and our key measure was who eats that last cookie on the plate. You see that the high power person on the left, randomly assigned, more likely to take the cookie, and we videotaped them. They ate with their mouths open, lips smacking, crumbs falling all over their sweaters. Power makes us consuming machines. It leads us to dangerous behavior. This was a study that Matt cited. We actually did have a Berkeley undergrad stand right near a pedestrian zone, acting like they wanted to walk across the street. And we simply coded when single cars approached that pedestrian and made eye contact, who was more likely to blaze through the pedestrian zone, which is illegal and dangerous. We have a very complicated way of coding the power of our cars. That's our scheme right there, from 1 to 5, from the graduate student AMC Pacer on the left to the fancy Mercedes. And no surprise, the higher the power of the car, the more likely you are to drive through the pedestrian zone, upwards of 46%. I always get asked these questions in Berkeley. What about Prius drivers? Prius was ranked number 4 on the power coding system, and they were the most likely to drive through the pedestrian zone, which led Conan O'Brien to tell the following joke. You hear that study from Berkeley about Prius drivers, how they drive terribly or like assholes? It's hard to drive well when you're patting yourself. This leads to all manner of problems online, from insults to threats to humiliation to shaming to the loss of modesty, a fear of missing out. Nice work by Brady and colleagues with John Jost, that what's viral very often in political discourse is what's morally inflaming. And I've given you a couple of examples. We kind of abandon other forms of reason and discourse and shift to a language that is morally inflaming, often abandoning the facts in a rational sense of discourse. And so to me, for online life, one of the central problems that I just, in dozens and dozens of hours, hundreds of hours of working in technology is how do you build a user's sense of their reputation and status online and constrain the tendencies to just blurt out, say things, etc. One solution comes from 17th century Germany. If you were inappropriately behaving in 17th century Europe, and then in puritanical America, you got the A in Scarlet's Letter. But I love that thing on the right. It's a donkey mask or a shame mask. And in Europe in the 17th century, if you said offensive things, you had to wear the donkey mask around town for a few weeks, just to remind yourself, like, comport yourself with a little bit of respect and civility. So maybe we should do that. Who knows? But it's a very serious challenge. All right. Finally, in my last 7 or 8 minutes, I want to turn to awe and aesthetics. And a really interesting experience I had. So that's Pete Docter, who's a director at Pixar. And I've worked with Pete as a scientific consultant in some of the really most cherished activities I've gotten to do on his film Inside Out, and then more recently Soul. And there is a sequel to Inside Out coming up, which is going to be very compelling. And I think it was around when Inside Out was out, on one of my last visits to Facebook, after 5 years of just working with them on stuff that eventually was erased. Um, I took Pete. He gave a talk about Inside Out. He was curious about this online community with billions of people. He looked at their virtual reality platforms and looked at all the latest stuff they're building. And as we were driving home, he said, it just strikes me, why isn't Facebook more like an experience of a Miyazaki film? And Miyazaki, of course, is the great Japanese animator who Pete reveres, and has done, just some of the great animation films of all time. I think it's a really interesting question at a deeper level, which is, are we turning to certain digital platforms and technologies for the wrong reasons, to touch people when we can't? Maybe we should be thinking about them more as museum exhibit experiences or the like. So I have been talking to a lot of people about designing for awe. You have a paper. Awe is really about just being amazed by vast mysteries that you don't understand. We have a study of awe from 26 different countries of every kind of economic, religious, political stripe or variety. We find awe in this incredibly vast array of sources, from just the moral beauty of people to nature, music, visual art, big ideas, mystical things, life and death, very common, universal, collective movement. My lab, and I have a book coming out on awe in the spring, hopefully, has just studied awe in every imaginable way, from nature to big vistas to being in Yosemite to being at the Great Wall in China, videos, etc. And it really has tried to capture the good that awe brings to communities, for the most part, with some important exceptions. And this in the spirit of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, "In the woods, we return to reason and faith. There I feel that nothing can befall me in life, that nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space," he's having an awe experience, "mean egotism vanishes." So we've done a ton of studies. One of them had undergrads be immersed near these tall eucalyptus trees, or in the same physical location, stand up and look at a science building at Berkeley. And what we find is those students become less self-important in the green, less entitled. They don't need as much money to do the study. There's a lot of really interesting work about how we are moved by the moral goodness of other people, like Mahatma Gandhi, or what Thomas Jefferson called the feeling of elevation. And there's just wonderful work, so relevant to digital stuff online, which is, when I see these morally inspiring acts, I have a shift in physiology, I cooperate more, I share more, I am urged to be a better person. Just good for us, as you well know, for that. And so, it's interesting, there are a lot of efforts right now when you think about the deep structure to these platforms of how can we take an emotion like awe, where people are searching in a state of wonder for, that Jesse Prinz and others have written about, that are searching for, discovery and meaning and insight. How can you build that into the design of technologies? It's doing good work, for example, in the richness of Pinterest and how people gather quotes that bring them awe. There's thinking about it right now, Google, about how do you build in, instead of searching narrowly, you build out a process of searching in wonder, and other kinds of extensions as well. So finally, these adventures are, of course, serious stuff. This is, whether we like it or not, as much as people deride Facebook or Meta, it's got 2.5 billion users. It's where people get news, it's et cetera. So, in thinking about extending what we know about healthy human communities in person to how do we extend these deep principles that have been evolving for millions of years in our evolution to this new technology, online stuff. And here are just some lessons for you guys to ponder. One is the principle of empathic awareness and control. I think we're learning pretty clearly that there is going to be efforts to train up systems to be emotionally sensitive, but users deserve to be aware, and they deserve to know what is happening with their emotions. Technology really needs to design for the constraints upon the abuses of power, but more generally, how do you build in social context that the brain is so sophisticated to understanding, which brings out our more collaborative behavior, right? I will also say it's been interesting for me, a lot of the bad stuff online is done by just a few people. Individual differences matter profoundly, as they do in human life, in social life, and we need to really model that there are going to be different principles for different people. I'm struck, when I did the work on those emoji and then reactions, and we started to see data flow out, like people are sharing the love symbol the most, right? Well, that's a good thing, just to be able to say it's more than just liking. It's like, no, I love the song that your daughter just made and with her new band, or I love the piece of art or this quote that you sent me. That's good news. But for whatever reason, there's the prioritization of other emotions like anger. Jonah Berger at Wharton has a lot of nice data showing we love sharing awesome things. We love sharing morally inspiring content. Why isn't technology designing as an ethical commitment for the better angels of our nature? When the Dalai Lama visited Google and they asked him what he thought, this is many years ago, and Google's principles do no harm. And he said, why don't you just make the world good? And I think it's a fair observation. I talked about awe because I think in some sense, the successes of technology have to do with art and music and sharing ideas and beauty. So we should be thinking about that. And then very importantly, and this is so often lost, but it's self-evident in my travels, is the platforms are really different. They differ profoundly. They will have different effects on well-being, different effects on stress, different effects on eating disorders or depression, different effects on political activism, right? So we really have to have a more nuanced conversation. And so if you want more, Matt very nicely mentioned, we have a lot of great stuff at the Greater Good Science Center, over 1 million readers, 800,000 people using our Greater Good in Action. I have a happiness course and podcast. I have a lab that has lots of papers and a couple books, but thank you so much. And I'm very much looking forward to it. Sarah and Deepak have to say.
Thank you, Dacher, for a superb presentation as always. I really enjoyed it. I always learn a little bit like I've read you and watched YouTube interviews, and I always learn a little bit more each time. So I wanted to actually touch on going back to your discussion around power and how you mentioned how can technology companies or social media really help users understand and build a sense of reputation. Yeah. And in your discussion of power, you mentioned the kind of a more postmodern view with Arendt and Foucault, and how power is not something that is hierarchical, that is given and it's diffused. It's something that like shifts between nodes, and that to me is very much bound up in a sense of agency and one's capacity to bring about an effect in the world. And and listening to you speak, I thought that really relates to this notion of sense of reputation. Can you talk more about how we can help online community members understand their own agency and how that impacts reputation building?
Yeah, and thank you for the brilliant synthesis of our, the contrasting views of power that my work comes out of, and thanks for the postmodern reference. And time and time again, like as an example, we worked on these social resolution tools at Facebook, and those were things like somebody makes a comment and it hurts somebody else's feelings, or a high schooler or 20-year-old starts kind of picking on another person on Facebook, right? And the design of those flows did not represent what happens in human life, which is I see the effects of my communication upon a community of people. I see their facial expressions. I hear their tone of voice. I hear someone weigh in like, hey man, you probably shouldn't say it that way. That's absent. And so what you have is communication where people, and with that contextual understanding, you sense your agency. Like, wow, I made that young kid cry, or I made that young guy blush in shame. You sense the context and the community of the effects of your actions, and we couldn't crack that problem and it was fundamental to what we were trying to reduce catfights and bullying and offensive language directed at people that fits within free speech. It was almost impossible to design, and so that's a challenge, right? How do we do it?
Yeah, it is. And yeah, thank you for your honesty, because I come up against these kinds of really complex, hard questions all the time.
And free speech is great. We all love freedom, but we usually exercise free speech in a community of people we're speaking to, and we see their faces and we hear their voices, and the brain has this complex representation of your agency. How am I affecting other people? And we had all kinds of, I proposed to Facebook, like, have a little like icon that says, here's how many people you've offended today. That didn't go too well.
I'm sure it did not. No. For those of you who might not know, Matt Katsaros and I met while we were both working on an integrity team at Facebook, and that's where I first met Dacher as well. So we are well aware of that.
So and this is the two-dimensional nature of the odd temporal quality of online communication, is it's missing that social context.
Yeah, absolutely. I will turn it over to Deepak. I have more questions, but I don't want to hog the spotlight.
Nice to see you.
You too.
Thanks, Sarah. Dacher, thank you so much. This is just an awesome talk. I think it's really contextualizing a lot of the things that we think about in this power framework, in these awe frameworks, and emotion as this kind of spatial semantic spaces. It's all very, very, very cool stuff. I think, like, for me, what this has me thinking about, because I spent a lot of time thinking about online hate and harassment, it has me thinking about, what does power mean? How are systems built to empower some of the abuse that we actually see online? So for example, I think it's great to see, I mean, it's great that actually it turns out that when you show people their effects on other people, a lot of people will say, okay, that's bad. I made that child cry. I don't want to do that. But there are still hundreds of thousands of accounts whose sole intention today is to cause and inflict emotional harm. And so how do we think about that? Because it seems like in some ways, the systems are designed to empower anyone, which is both democratizing, but also terrifying if we think about hate and harassment. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on that,
Yeah, this is almost an ethical commitment, right? Deepak, what a spectacular observation. In fact, it gave me goosebumps that you just offered. Like, this is a problem of our times. For hundreds of thousands of years, when we evolved in these collaborative groups, and they had their problems and they had violence, et cetera, but bad actors in groups who are spreading hate did not live long. They were asked to leave the groups. They were exiled. They were dealt with clarity, right? And that is a deep tendency in human culture and human community. Bad actors at work are increasingly, if you're a chronic sexual harasser, you will lose your job, right? Thank goodness, et cetera. If you're a bully in school, immediately and people take action. And that has not been, as you say, people haven't committed to that, even though if you were to look at the deep social principles of human community, it's going to be top 10, right? It's in all the universal the laws of moral code. So there it is. It's not as effectively built in. So I would turn the question on you, Deepak. What are you going to do? What are you going to do?
It's a very fascinating question, and it's so part of what we're thinking about in terms of giving people more power. And we're still thinking about this because there's so many downstream implications of this, right? But okay, what if you were to give somebody a tool that allowed them just more control over the things that they see? Well, automatically you have all sorts of questions like, okay, does that mean filter bubbles? Does that where do you draw the line? If you give people the universe to get their own kind of worldview and give them all of that power, well, does that mean that we are actually effectively curbing the social process in altogether? So these are some very thorny questions, but that's one idea, you know, like if we were to take the power that we currently have kind of democratized to everybody, all types of accounts, abusive accounts or non-abusive accounts, abusive people, non-abusive people, whatever. And that dichotomy obviously is kind of fake because nobody's just an abusive person or a non-abusive person. What does that mean, and how does that shift the balance in terms of tackling hate and harassment? So that's kind of some of the things that we're thinking about. I'll pass it back over to Sarah.
And I'll just say an interesting note. I think we're in this interesting moment of cultural evolution. At UC Berkeley, a few years ago, we had the Free Speech Week that you may have seen in national news, where Milo Yiannopoulos came, who loves outing gay people and, you know, and giving away their personal information. There's this big protest, and we had a couple of forums at the law school, and I saw the younger generation saying, free speech is great, but it has to be understood in the context of harm that it can stir through these digital social networks. So I think it's a fundamental question that we need multiple perspectives upon. I was struck by that. And I hope you do good work.
Yeah, Deepak, we should talk. I spend a lot of time on the misinformation team at Twitter thinking about free speech and what that means. And the consummate example that is given when I speak with research participants who we have labeled for spreading misinformation is, well, I know you can't yell fire in a crowded theater.
Right.
So it's like they understand there is a slippage, but where the point at which free speech stops being permissible is very, very fuzzy.
Yeah, it's a dynamic question.
It's very, so I like Deepak mentioned this idea of, you know, these accounts that are out there purposefully to harass and to harm, and these are kind of people I would say who are like known abusers. They know they're out there. They might be getting paid by a despotic government. They might just be mean people. You know, who knows? But like, Dacher, I want to hear your thoughts on the idea. Again, this is getting back to power, and like from taking like a more like linguistic anthropologic perspective. This idea that like things like covert racism can happen. You know, people will reinforce and put forth stereotypes that are about racial and ethnic categories unbeknownst to them. They don't intend remarks or actions to be racist. They're not consciously doing this. So when it comes to how we think about online communities and the processes they go through, how can we help community members understand this power that they have, that they are exercising in perhaps a harmful way? I
mean, I think that part of, you know, it goes back to empathic awareness to me, and it's a pretty solid principle of, you know, what are my emotions, how is this digital interface representing them, and how is it affecting other people? And you know, I think there, you know, I would build a tool that's an option or a feature that says every day you get a representation, and our lab could build that. You know, I assign those maps because that's what it does, is you can map the rich space of human emotion pretty easily. And now you can do it in automated fashion. I'd say, here's how you've affected people, right? Empathic awareness. Oh, you know, yours is a little, the angry, ashamed piece of this semantic space that Deepak referred to is a little bit brighter. And you let people be aware as a starting point. You know, that in part is the question right now about safe spaces, and it's how it's shifting our definition of free speech in some sense, and triggers and the like. Is a new generation is saying this stuff is hurtful and offensive, and we're letting you know the effects of unconscious behavior. And so it would be interesting as a feature to do that, right? And to let people be aware, and then you hope, you know, their reason prevails.
I
would offer a feature of, you know, here are hurtful online entities, you know, and I would designate them as such. Humans appreciate that.
Yeah, I agree. I would love to be able to do that as well.
It has
Deepak,
me
over to you.
thinking, yeah, it has me thinking, I mean, just kind of following on that, it has me really thinking about, some of the kinds of interstitial things that we are trying, folks at Twitter are trying, folks at Facebook are trying, Instagram, all over the place, where it's just
Yeah.
like, okay, well, a nudge, you post something, or right before the thing gets posted to the platform, it's like, hey, the thing that you're about to post may be maybe construed this way, maybe you're actually just being terrible, maybe you are
Yeah.
threatening some sort of like you're sending a death threat or something, and
Yeah.
and the effects that those things can have. We do some work, we're doing some work right now on understanding these kinds of abusive interactions on Reddit, and what we're seeing is that actually the vast majority of
Yep.
folks that actually engage in toxic behaviors are kind of in a one-off category, I should say. So
Yeah.
it's like, because of a bunch of different circumstances, an argument gets heated, something happens, somebody decides to either say something very offensive, something hurtful, something terrible. But for those cases, for sure, like some sort of like interstitial, some sort of awareness can maybe really help. And the nice, maybe encouraging part is that it's a good chunk of the people that engage in this kind of behavior.
Right.
It's 60%, 70%. I'm just, I'm still stuck in thinking about like, how do we get to, what are the tools? Maybe if I can change this into maybe a community moderation kind of context,
Yeah.
what tools would be helpful from the perspective of moderators to give them the power for, say, the 30% of accounts that are just going to be, state-sponsored troll actors or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And if you have any thoughts on how to shift the balance of power in their favor.
Yeah, and Deepak, my experience is totally aligned with yours. Like most people, when they make a mistake online, you give them a chance to say sorry, and they do, and they get better, right? And we all make mistakes, right? And so that was part of the social resolution tools. And then these systemic bad actors, I think they need to be named, and they need to, their communication needs that donkey mask attached to it, just to gut it, because that's that's what we would do in different ways in our ordinary social communities, through reputational discourse. Well, that guy is always talking like that, he's a sexist, right? And that I think that has to be built in as a possible feature.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I think about this like because there's this tension, of course, with anonymity and things, all the great things that actually anonymity provides for the internet, right? We allow free dissent. It allows us to speak our minds. It allows us to express our true identities in many ways that we can't do maybe in our real world existence, and air quotes, because the internet is obviously a real place. But I wonder about that tension too, that balancing, how do we enable people to remain anonymous, but also tag some sort of reputation identity. I mean, I think these are the really thorny issues that we're thinking about today, but it's not really anything more than a comment, but it's something that...
And sorry about the, I just saw Sudhir's name, and I know he's thought for years about this question of like, how do you work with those people? The quote, I don't, bad actors or problematic cases. So it might be interesting to bring him in, but love to hear what he has to say. But yeah, no, it's a big problem, and I'm glad you guys are thinking about it.
Sudhir asked, you write a lot about the fact that the impact that power has on our health and well-being. It produces stress and anxiety, etc. He wants to ask, how can we empower the platforms better? Often the media, academics, etc., kind of putting platforms on defensive, and for many good reasons, I'm sure, but we shouldn't be surprised when they act defensive. And is there advice or an approach that you have about how we, and I guess we can be interpreted in many ways, can be empathic?
I agree. Thank you, Sudhir. That's from Sudhir Venkatesh, who, hey Sudhir, I have to tell a Sudhir story. When I'm sorry, but this one's really personal. When I was working on my power book, my older daughter, who graduated, is just terrific reader. She's like, well, Dad, I found the book. I really hope you can write a book, because I know you struggle with writing like this. And it was Sudhir's book. And I happened to be a month later, I was working with him. So yeah, the narrative, it's so interesting to me. And I felt like, Sudhir, I was trying to get that a bit on my question about aesthetics and art and cultural change. When you go through, Black Lives Matter is because of digital platforms. New artists you would never know of are because of digital platforms. Democratized music, our exposure to other cultures, on down the line. And I think that if we did the right kind of science, it would say the platforms are empowering this new kind of empathy and understanding that did not exist before, right? So part to me is, if, you know, Jonah Berger's work and then our finding that the platforms allow us to share a lot of affection and encouragement. And in fact, that's if you look at basic base rates, that's what most people are doing online. And you know, there are the dramatic counter examples, and they're deep problems, but that's part of the narrative that and the design is to think of, and that's why I think Pete Docter's question of like, maybe we should be building in the pro-social aesthetic dimensions to this experience and designing for that, right? Because there is a ton of good stuff happening, and to me, that's the great. I think it's a transcendent story of new power online that no one talks about. They take it for granted that I get to listen to this. You know, I listen to this Brazilian music I would never have known of today because of online. You know, of a guy who's 50 years old who's just getting his music career going. So I think that kind of power. And to Sarah's point, it's almost this postmodern power in some funny way. Like it comes from everywhere, right? And we gotta name it and empower it. Am I getting to your question, Cedar, or am I way off?
No, it's you're getting to it absolutely. It's you know, I think about a friend of mine who's a scholar of African American studies.
Yeah.
Who makes this argument that that for a lot of African Americans, the platforms are their vehicle to make white supremacy visible, and so they are less living in a different kind of space and feeling empowered because they can see it and so it's not lurking in a way. And it's just filled with all of these contradictions that at the same time. So yeah, thank you for your response. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and I just want to say Sudhir got me to think deeply about bad stuff online and how we grapple with it. So it's good to see you. Hope to see you again soon.
There is another question in the chat, and if others have questions, feel free to drop them in. This one says, this comes from John Fallow. You mentioned the different emojis in use. Given your expertise, do you feel it's possible to create gradients of meaning? I'm thinking of how Facebook's haha reaction can mean both amusement and mockery, kind of at the same time.
Yeah, and this is, you know, I would thank you, John. You've just like in one quick comment summarized about 25 years of my science, which is why you should look at alancowan.com and our papers on mapping semantic spaces of emotion. We did a paper of laughter that shows there are, I think, 50 kinds of laughs, you know, and they have very powerful different meanings of sarcasm and love and disgust and, you know, ecstasy and so forth. So yeah, and this is one of the challenges of, like, you know, from an emotion scientist to go from this to 5 emotions, you're still missing 60% of our emotional lives. And that's the challenge. That's the design challenge. And it gets even worse with this thing. Because if I have 22 emotions on that, I can't see it. So it's a challenge. But yes, John, laughter is one of the richest vocabularies. It's millions of years old in our primate evolution. It's fundamental to social life. But you can build the sounds in interesting ways to track different kinds of interactions. And check out this recent semantic space computational work of Alan Cowan on these questions.
We've been talking a lot about empowerment and, you know, empowering the platforms, empowering people. And I was discussing this with my partner the other day, this notion of a social media company that I can empower users. It grates of patriarchy to me to some extent, as if
Yeah.
power is this hierarchical thing that Twitter has the ability to give to someone.
Yeah.
But if we are in a state where we're more egalitarian, and we think about how can we empower users, there's this point at which I can say I'm developing a tool or a feature to empower people, but that power is not felt unless there is a result.
Yeah.
I can report on Facebook. If nothing
Yeah.
happened, I don't feel I have any power.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
this is something that, it's been swirling in my head recently,
Oh my
this
God.
notion of, we can't just say we empower people. There has to be, their agency has to be recognized.
Yeah.
So it's not really a question, it's just a conundrum.
Well, no, but it points to, and I hope all of our audience members are recognizing how hard this design work is, right? We, usually so the question of how do I sense my agency online? That's a really important question. We know we're blurting stuff out and we're quickly sending stuff, but I think, this richer model of human agency that the 21st century has allowed for through a lot of rights battles in the recent times, how do you give people that sense, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's going to require some of the design principles we've been talking about, like, this is who you're with. This is your tribe of 20 people that this is how how about a little icon that pops in and says, here's how you've inspired people today. Here's how you've lifted people up, right? And then the other question of people's experience online of how do I report something that's problematic. When we did that work at Facebook, it disappeared into a reporting vortex that they never saw. Maybe some little thing came in 2 weeks later. They don't know what it was. It was not how humans think about, the efficacy of their actions in dealing with moral wrongdoing. So a lot of work needs to be done on that. And you're asking the right question. That's a great question about agency.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think that we're just at about time, unless you want to leave us with any kind of parting thoughts on this topic.
I guess I would go to Sudhir's observation, and Sudhir always likes putting things on their head, but but it really, in my journeys through, I was like, you platforms, it's great to empower people. I think it's done it in interesting ways, but think about the good power that these platforms can have, right? That you can, just think about that and be committed to that. Where a Google search could be more about wonder and discovery. You could change a lot of people's minds with that simple feature. Apple, their steps function, people are walking more. So I think Sudhir's got, and I was struck how, and Deepak and Sarah, I don't, think about the good power, empower you guys to oh, this is the good stuff we can do, right? Because that's a good thing to be animated by. And I hope this conversation points us in that direction.